talking about in many places in some of the areas of Kentucky where the company first started about getting, reliable telephone service. There were still somewhat unreliable telephone connections in some of the foothills of eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, let alone think about just the level of infrastructure was really not getting us very far. That we needed to come up with a different model for engaging with local communities, and more importantly, for then helping those communities speak to policymakers at the state and eventually the federal level to tell them about, the situation and why it was important. There was also a level of basic education and understanding that was needed at that point in time. Even the very basics of showing a city that they could have a website where you could do some basic things like pay parking tickets or pay for your children's school lunch or even let alone the things that we do today on the internet. 10 years ago, in many parts of the United States, this was still new and novel. And so even those basic applications, helping communities were an important part of encouraging and educating about demand for broadband services as a critical part of this broadband ecosystem. Right now, we're doing very similar work in 9 states and also the territory of Puerto Rico. Approximately 25% of the population in the United States is within one of those 10 jurisdictions. And the work that we're doing really follows on from the work that I did at the Federal Communications Commission on the National Broadband Plan, which was, again, to articulate a set of goals for the nation to achieve, but then to recognize that looking at broadband simply from the standpoint of an access issue, was actually only looking at one component, and perhaps in many ways the hardest component to articulate to policymakers as to why broadband is important. But we also talked a lot about the need for access to devices and applications and community use and beneficial use of broadband applications as a critical component to helping communities understand and educate their own decision makers about the need for high-speed broadband. So the model that we've somewhat developed, that I'll get into a little bit in detail a little bit later, really relies on 4 ways of breaking this argument down. I think as the prior presentation showed, it seems to me that there is a similar need in Europe to have a very strong and affirmative agenda for communicating to policymakers about the need for high-speed broadband in rural areas. There's a similar need in the United States. And so when we were faced with this challenge, when we're trying to get state government leaders and federal government leaders to really understand the challenges that particular communities have, we really broke it down into these 4 types of 4 categories of discussion. The idea is that when you're speaking to a policymaker, you're trying to make this as basic as possible, right? As the prior presenter just talked about. If you walk into a person's office and start talking about 100 megabits per second, and we wish it was, 1,000 megabits per second, you lose half of the audience. And then the other half of the audience kind of wonders what's wrong with 100 and what's wrong with even 10. So the idea is to really, to articulate this in a different way to really help demonstrate the specific uses and benefits that it can have. So the 4 areas are to identify and document the gaps. This is actually the critical step that we see at Connected Nation. This is not just talking about generalities of the situation of the community, but really digging in and looking at not just the infrastructure that's available in the community, but also how is that community utilizing the infrastructure? What is the lack of infrastructure? What particular applications and uses are being held back? That almost has to be very community specific. But one thing that we've tried to do as a nonprofit is to try to systematize the collection and the presentation of that so as to make it easier for a community to start from scratch, to try to make that presentation. We kind of, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about a program that we call a connected program, where it's designed to try to make that data collection process as easy as possible, which then hopefully gives basically a toolkit to those communities to go to their decision makers. The second point is really more of a methodology point, which is what we call it engage all stakeholders, and I should have changed that word. I really dislike the word stakeholder, but it's what our company uses. So I am using the company line here, but the idea of stakeholders is that it's literally everybody in this room, but also the people that you know in this room that should be in this room. It's important that we broaden the discussion as wide as possible inside our communities to include not simply the obvious attendees in this process, but to include the people that everybody in every community knows we need to really talk to this. We need to talk to this person. We think about this at the state level in the United States, and also at the local and regional level. But this includes every sector of the economy, essentially. We're talking not just education, but also the public library system in the United States is very important in our broadband discussions. The local business community, the healthcare community, the local government itself, but not just one level of local government, but the public safety agencies compared to the Department of Transportation, who controls the roads, who controls the terms under which somebody could dig up the road. All of these people need to be involved in this discussion. What we, in the methodology that we do, is that we take the identify and document the gaps, and then we really try to present that in a very similar forum like this, a room as large as possible inside that community of everybody who needs to be in there so they can understand what's being held back. So that's what we mean by engage all stakeholders. In this, we also include the provider community and also the applications community as well. An important level of our engagement is to try to help elevate these discussions to the right people. We often notice in the communities we work with that they may have been trying to talk to the local broadband provider about their problems for the last 5, 10 years or so, but they never quite talked to the right person. It's probably a familiar story to many of you. What our job is to get the right person from those companies into that room. For the most part, the community relations managers for our local telephone companies, their job is to keep communities quiet, not to serve communities. So part of what we try to do is to make sure the right people hear these discussions. The third point is to really embrace all alternatives. We don't come into this from the standpoint of thinking that any one particular technology is better, or is the only answer. No disrespect to fiber from that standpoint, but we really try, since we're dealing with communities. One of our states is the state of Alaska. Alaska doesn't have roads to most villages. So the idea of fiber in those communities is just a completely different issue than it is in another one of our states, which is the state of Michigan, which actually has a fair amount of fiber. It just has 20% of the workforce unemployed. It's a completely different set of issues in Michigan than in Alaska. So that's when we think about embracing all alternatives, it's really identifying those gaps and coming up with benefits or plans that are directly related to each specific community. And then the third kind of key that we notice, or that we find to be important in maintaining momentum behind a local broadband initiative, is to produce immediate and tangible results. And this doesn't really have to be much, but it has to be something that's, we have a phrase called low-hanging fruit. It's like, you always pick the lowest hanging apples on the tree because they're the easiest ones to reach, right? And so when we engage a local team, we try to identify those easy victories. And it might be something as simple as doubling the size of the of the number of computers that the public library has for public access to the internet. You know, something that the major librarian had been asking the mayor for the last 5 years for an increase in the budget for that, and really kind of fell onto deaf ears. But that's also something relatively simple. If We Connect a Nation can get the computers donated from a computer company, and we can figure out a way to get the internet connection upgraded and maybe get a Wi-Fi network installed, all of a sudden it becomes a relatively easy project. And then the community group that we form to put that group together now has a very quick victory. Another quick victory that we had was in the plant was actually attracting a fiber investment to make sure that a plant that was about to close and lay off or fire about 50 jobs stay in town, because we finally were able to get the right person at the provider community to talk to the plant manager. And it's really identifying those early victories. I think it's important. So that's another part of our methodology. I'm going to breeze through these next few slides. This is a little bit about how data intensive we like to get. This is the state of Michigan. You know, it's not really meant for you to read. This is just meant for you to look at and nod your head and say, yeah, the data is here. But we have data for every county in the state based on what we know about the work that we've done with regard to mapping the broadband infrastructure in the state. And so to let people, you know, to communicate this type of information directly to county managers. So, you know, this is, you know, there's one thing that I would like to point out is that and you'll have this, I believe, one of the columns is household density. There are some really very rural areas. You see the difference between household density of 5 households per square, this is per square mile, which is the United States, compared to 156. So there's a wide range of disparity in terms of density. But the idea is to take that kind of table of numbers and present it in a way that decision makers at a community can understand and look at it, which is the maps. Another important step of this, this is the identify gaps part of the process, is to not just take people at their word as to whether broadband's available, but to have engineering teams go out and kind of verify this. This is actually a portion of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And it's a map of availability of cable broadband. San Juan is the largest city in Puerto Rico. There's no reason why San Juan shouldn't be as connected as any major city in any developed country. But the areas in red are areas where the local cable company claimed that cable broadband was available, but when we sent out an engineering team to assess it, we found that no equipment, we couldn't find any equipment associated with it. I like to use that slide to kind of show that, you know, it's like a trust but verify type approach. And these other, so part of this is when you convene a local group, by thinking about access, is to really understand where the existing infrastructure is and where its failings are. The next important part that we do is we try to benchmark communities' progress. I was speaking, you know, in the break about how do you communicate this information to national decision makers, state decision makers, and even just get the attention sometimes of local and regional politicians or decision makers. One important tool that we use in the National Broadband Plan, the team that I was on, was that we established a number of national goals and benchmarks. This is the first time in the United States, we were late to the broadband planning game. 2009 was our first one, but we set 3 different benchmarks for basic broadband, advanced broadband, and mobile broadband. What we've done here at Connected Nation is we took as much data as we could, and each little kind of, you know, pixel on there is a county, which is a Sokovia, is kind of like it's about the same size of a county in the United States, maybe a little larger. But we tried to benchmark them up against those 3 measurements, and to start giving communities grades, and different, you know, community leaders either like grades or they really dislike grades. They don't like to be seen as failing in anything. So But there are some, failing grades in this that do get people's attention. And this has been a quite effective tool that we've used to be able to present to policymakers to show, look, these regions are falling behind these national benchmarks. This is a bit of a, we call this as an index because we've weighted each of the 3 benchmarks. My favorite story, actually, and again, I really don't want to sound like I've got a thing with fiber, but my favorite story is a county, if I can find the county, is actually this county right here in Nevada, which is famous for 2 things. One of the things it's famous for is it's the area that has the secret military installation that we never admitted existed, called, which you might have heard about, called Area 51, which some people claim is where the alien spaceships crashed and we're holding them there. It's famous for that. It's also famous for it's the only fiber to the home network in the state of Nevada. Is a town called Lincoln, which is a town probably this size, would be my guess, about the same size as the town that we're in right now. But it's the only town, and as you can imagine, it's an interesting place. We published this map, and they called us up, and they asked, why don't we have the only fiber to the home network in Nevada, how come we don't get an A, right? And we said, well, okay, we'll look into it. My first reaction to this was, great, we screwed up the index. But when we explored this, we know they did have a fiber to the home network. That was great. In the town, the surrounding area didn't have fiber. That wouldn't have necessarily been a reason not to give them a good grade. But we looked at the quality of the mobile broadband in that network, and they were not even getting a cellular data service. There was not even 2G, let alone 3G or 4G cellular. And so that's why they got dinged and got put at, I think they ended up with like a B- or something like that. And that was actually a very useful discussion to have with that community to get them to think that there was more involved here than just one aspect of their infrastructure, but they needed to think about other aspects of their infrastructure, which included the mobile connectivity. And there was a whole host of reasons as to why they couldn't have mobile connectivity, and it turned out to be related to that Army base or that Air Force base and all this type of stuff where, one can imagine in a secret military installation, it's kind of hard to put up towers, things like that. But anyways, it was still an interesting discussion. We also do things about a critical component to this is broadband adoption and adoption trends. These are research surveys that we do inside the communities directly. The goal here is really to inform the policymakers in the community about the situation that they're in. This is for Puerto Rico, so this is why you see some kind of extremes here of broadband adoption in Puerto Rico is 31% compared to, at this time, 67% nationally. So this got a lot of people's attention, obviously, in Puerto Rico. But also, we have to find out the reasons why. And it's actually interesting to see how these vary among communities. There's a lot of commonalities, but each community is different in its own different way. Kind of the way we've decided to try to present all this information is based on a very simple theory, which is that, smaller towns, rural areas, rural communities have the most to gain from broadband services and have the most to gain from high-speed connectivity. But for smaller communities and for even mid-sized communities, the cost of doing things like a technology plan or coming up with solutions is actually higher, right? It's like Helsinki, doesn't need to be told how to think about broadband necessarily, but a community that may not have experts in this field, or may have a few experts in some areas, but don't really know where to start in terms of trying to have this discussion. So our working approach, which is a grant-funded program through the federal government, is to create a kind of almost a systematized community planning process that we call the Connected Engagement Program. We emphasize local participation, as I talked about before. We try to leverage local assets and support collaborative action. It's all premised on a self-assessment in this data gathering process, and almost using that process as a way to educate the community and the right people in the community as a whole as to their situation. And our whole point is to enable informed and politically supported planning decisions. Basically, the point here is that if we make the technology planning process faster and easier and less expensive, the more communities that will start to engage in this process. There's more detail here than we know. I'll get to some key learnings here, but we have these four same steps again. Engage, assess, plan, and act. Those are the four steps that I talked about earlier. This is really the method that we utilize. A very basic way that we try to frame these issues for decision makers is to try to get decision makers to think about all of these issues. From an access standpoint, is our infrastructure adequate? That's the easy one for the people in this room to have that discussion about. But also, I think we need to make sure that we're having discussions about adoption. Like, how is this community addressing barriers to home broadband adoption? We've run into a number of communities that have adoption rates, like in Puerto Rico, of 30%. That has a significant impact on the economics of a network infrastructure in that community. The difference between knowing only 3 out of 10 people will subscribe as opposed to 7 out of 10 homes will subscribe, is the difference between profit and loss, between getting any investment at all. So in Puerto Rico, their broadband planning initiatives are focusing almost exclusively on adoption because they know they have to cross that challenge first. They need to train their citizens. And then use, which is like, are we using broadband to improve the quality of life in this community? There's 13 different indicators. The net result of this is to help create a specialized community technology plan. We're doing this right now in about 200 communities in our 10 states. We're in various different degrees of completing this process. This is some generalizations. The framework is to basically have it be a facilitated engagement. We have a web portal which really helps with the data gathering by the community. We do have local staff that will then go out and facilitate the meetings, and the meetings are very much like what the gathering we're having right here today, tend to take place in school buildings. And so the community will then kind of divide up into some teams, and a group of people over there will go say, we'll go look at our middle mile infrastructure and try to come back to the next meeting. We'll have monthly meetings. It tends to take somewhere between 6 to 9 months to develop one of these plans. Again, we've tried to centralize the components of this process that could be centralized, like what does a plan look like, what does it include, what types of data do you have to make it easier for the community to kind of complete this work. Like I said, we're doing this with in about approximately 200 communities in 10 states right now. Right now, we've since 1 year since the inception of the program, we've completed 50 community technology plans, each of which have some level of early success. Let me just kind of jump to some of the lessons. And I'll be more than happy to talk to you more about that program. This is the kind of takeaways I take. So how do you get a community engaged, and how do you, more importantly, how do you convince people outside the community to listen to that community? Having high-level goals and focus points are important. We have the National Broadband Plan, which articulates certain standards for access, adoption, and use. Those are very useful to explain to somebody who says, I'm not sure why I'm paying attention to this. We've also found that state or provincial or regional leadership is actually quite important too. And in fact, that was a learning that we didn't really have until we started doing this process. Again, this observation here that if you make it easier and less expensive for communities to engage on broadband and to plan, come up with technology plans, simple fact is more communities will do so. So we've tried to make it as costless as low cost as possible. We also intentionally try to stir up the competitive spirit between communities in the states that we work. we kind of want one community to be jealous of another community for coming up with their technology plan first. And that is almost a self-motivating factor that we utilize to make sure that some communities will maybe start this process up, even if they're not sure, that they know broadband is important, but they don't know if they really want to do this. But they certainly don't want to fall behind their peers. And they don't want to not have something that their neighbors have. We've seen that that number kind of comes around when we reach 8 to 12 engagements in a geographic area. Now, our engagements are at kind of the municipality or county level, so anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 residents or so, as an aggregate. So we see once we've done about 8 or so of those, we then end up with a waiting list of 20 to 30 similar jurisdictions wanting to do the same thing, because now it's something that seems much more tangible and real to them. And the last thing that I will leave you with is that as local governments have an extraordinary number of levers available to them to affect broadband in their community. And oftentimes it's just a matter of articulating them and reminding decision makers about this. We know about the ideas of permitting, zoning, and tower siting, and things like that, or just the ability to utilize the public land for broadband facilities. We have engineers that will go out and will basically try to help design out networks in areas that will just use the public facilities, and will go to that community and say, you already own this property. If there was a tower there and fiber feeding that tower, this community doesn't have an access challenge like it does today. Just providing that information to the right person in the community can make a wealth of difference. Another important thing is purchasing power, or as the government is, in most communities, is probably the largest consumer of broadband services. Anne-Marie talked about this very effectively as the network paying for itself, just in the cost savings from the government. That can't be said enough, that there's significant power that local governments have with regard to broadband services, and that gives them a lot more leverage than they may realize. What we've seen is we see oftentimes a lot of progress with our service provider community if they realize that they can't sell one kind of circuit to the school and a different kind of circuit to the police department, and also something different to town hall. But that if they're sitting with all of those entities on the other side of the table to say, we're going to buy our bandwidth together, and we want as good a terms as possible, and we want it to be as high speed as possible, the terms all of a sudden change fairly quickly. But just getting those different government purchasing entities to sit down together and make and basically engage in joint purchasing, can be very complicated. So those are just some of the experiences that we have in the United States in doing a lot of this kind of regional outreach. And so we've been, my company's been doing this for a fair number of years, but I'm really encouraged to see you all in the Engaged partnership, utilizing a lot of this, what I've kind of noticed, a lot of the same techniques. But I hope to be able to answer as many questions that you all have, and also really just to kind of offer up some thoughts or ideas if you have some. But I think it's absolutely critical that we figure out the best ways of communicating the needs of rural areas and smaller communities for high-speed broadband to the right decision makers. And I think it's absolutely critical that one way of doing this is to try to break this down into those 4 key areas that I've talked about before, in terms of make informed decision making, trying to make sure that all stakeholders are at the table, because I think that's the only formula that we've seen in the United States that really succeeds in getting significant change, both to the access network, but also to the way that those communities utilize broadband in schools and in hospitals and in government services. So with that, I'll open the floor to any questions. And once again, very much appreciate the invitation to come here and speak and share with you today.